Well, I just want to start off by just, observing that the film wouldn't really work without the performance of Michael Strong and just his ability to kind of completely take you from this place of this abstracted person on stage who's sort of doing a lecture, but then take you into this very intimate, private, kind of dark place, of course, enhanced by the camera work and the lighting and everything, but his ability to kind of do that is quite extraordinary. So, I wonder if we could kind of begin with, what each of your relation was to Michael Strong, the actor. If we could start with that. Now, Lee, you had acted with him and seen him as well perform, of course.
My first play, and I don't know whether it was his first play, was Detective Story in 1952. and I don't know if it was his first play, but we were two young actors going to the actor's studio, and he played a character that was not unlike this. You remember he came in as a prisoner with Joe Wiseman. Do you remember what I'm talking about? Where Joe Wiseman was the violent one who, would blah, blah, blah. And Mike was the one who was dizzy, who couldn't remember, who said, wah, wah. And that sense of that character, of one who can't quite catch up with what was happening or his own thoughts, was an element that I felt he used in such an extraordinary way in this. I mean, this is, when we look for art, to use that part of himself, which wanders, because Mike's head wandered like that, and to use it to do something like this was just extraordinary.
And this originated in a monologue that he worked on in the actor's studio, and that's where Paul Newman had first seen it and gotten that idea. And you saw him perform that originally?
Yes, yeah. I did. And it was, like one of those things that happens at the studio where you say, wow, this is something he found, where he put all of the things that worked for him and didn't work for him together, with his own truth, his own life. And he was a very young guy. He played, I guess it was 40s or 50s, but he was very young when he did that.
And David, how did you get involved with making the short film? You composed the music. Were you there at all for the actual shooting of any of it, or only afterwards working with Newman?
Well, I saw as much as possible when I was invited, and my joy just in knowing Paul from, I'd worked on JB in 1958, and at that time, they had what today would be considered to be indie. Now, you can make a film yourself with an iPhone. At that time, what Paul Newman did was he loved seeing Michael's performance so much, and he loved the theater so much, and he loved acting, and he loved Chekhov, that he decided he wanted to somehow preserve and enhance that fantastic, legendary performance so that it could be seen on film and documented. And thanks to Jack guarding the film for decades, and thanks to the Lincoln Center Film Society for finally, all these years later, making it available for this very first, which will only be the beginning for years to come, of this wonderful film, is just so thrilling. The great person who can remind us all what we're here for, John Keats, said, "A thing of beauty is a joy forever." I haven't seen the film since 1959. And at that time, around that time, I was in working for Shakespeare in the Park when I wasn't working at the post office, or playing with Oscar Pettiford at Birdland, or other types of various employment. I saw Lee at Shakespeare in the Park, and remembered what Joe Papp was doing then. And all of us were doing what was considered to be impossible, and by many people in the society considered to be a group of no-goodniks. And Estelle Parsons, who's here from the Actors Studio tonight, I used to see her. I remember seeing, I don't want to go into stuff, but I remember seeing her at the same time that I met Paul and everyone else. And I was living on Christopher Street, right across from the Theatre de Lys, and I must have seen Three Penny Opera about 6 or 7 or 8 times. And all those actors and all the poets and the painters and musicians, when I was working with Jack Kerouac at that time, no one was thinking about network or career ops because there weren't supposed to be any. We were all doing it because we loved it and we cared about it, and we hoped that our presence could put a little something teeny into the pot. And this film was one of those magical things. So hopefully for all you young filmmakers, you'll find some terrific cellist or violinist or bassoon player or composer or all of the above working at a dry cleaning store with enormous gifts, and you could have them do the score for your film. And if you're a musician, you'll try to be with actors and poets and dancers and playwrights so that we can raise our IQs above the level that we're told is all we deserve to be at, which is usually -7. And for anybody who wants to do anything, to dare to do it, to realize that all good things come to those who wait. And if you do something beautiful, it will stay beautiful. And for all the rest, as Miles Davis so eloquently said, the same year, 1959, in his great song, So What?
Well, what I like to say is actually what's remarkable about this film is that the Actors Studio at that point reached an apex in acting. It revolutionized the world of acting. And what was remarkable about Paul is that he didn't do this as a first directing job. Paul he spent his own money, $200,000, which today would be a little over $2 million. What he was excited about was because Mike was not known as a film star. He didn't go, he could have gone to any Hollywood actor or film actor. But when he saw this work, he felt it was revolutionary. In a sense, it's exactly what was happening with the actors in the Actors Studio. We were all young at that point, and we realized that something important had happened. What was that? Which is what Lee brilliantly explained. The fact that the work of art, what makes a work of art if it's personal. And that's what's so astonishing, that he was able to find these things in himself. But to me, the great tribute to Paul is the fact that he was trying for the world to see a kind of acting that they had not seen before. And unfortunately, people at that time, Chekhov, what? Who is this actor? We never heard of him. And he was hurt. So that what happened was that finally, that's why he took his name off, because he wanted Mike to be free to do whatever he wanted to do. But you know, David told me an interesting story, which I think you should tell them, that when you saw Paul a couple of years before he passed away, tell that story.
I'll try to make it brief. The Cherry Lane Theater was having a production of Our Town, and Maya Dillon, a wonderful actress, a good friend of Keir DeLay, who also did The Harmfulness of Tobacco, which I saw years ago, called up and said, look, we're in this terrific production of Paul Newman's, as always, is kind of behind the scenes, not only appearing in it, but bringing it together. So please come down. And I thought, boy, I never had seen the film since 1959. I thought it'd be great to ask him, but I didn't want to go backstage after not seeing him for years and have him think the only reason I came was to get a copy of the film. So I saw this incredibly beautiful production. I went back afterwards and I saw him. And he said, Amram, I haven't seen you for years. What have you been doing? So we talked and I spoke about all the things I knew he was doing to help out in this community and all that wonderful stuff. And then he said to me, do you know anybody that's got a copy of the film? And I knew which film he meant. And I said, well, Paul, I was going to ask you the same thing, but I thought it'd be kind of crude to come back after years and not even say hello. I don't know. I was hoping maybe you knew. And he said, no, he said, it disappeared. I have no idea where it is or anybody who has a copy. And so at that point, I took a beautiful memory, like we all do, and put it in the side pocket. And then when I heard when Laurie called up and said that Jack Garfein, whom I hadn't seen for so long, was in New York and that the film told me the story of the film, I thought, my gosh. And then to come and see it 58 years later, I guess, I'm not even sure of the math, 1959 till now, 58 years, I guess it is, was pretty extraordinary. And I never realized how great the cinematography was. And being somewhat older than I was 58 years ago, I could appreciate the acting more. I could appreciate Chekhov more. And two of my own kids are here, and they have the blessing of seeing that beautiful acting, that beautiful craftsmanship, that idealism, the beauty of the writing, all of it preserved so that now a whole new generation could see it. And I think 100 years from now, people are really going to enjoy that. So I thank all the people who made this possible. And I also want to thank all of you for coming and showing that New York still is a culture, soul, capital of excellence and idealism, no matter what.
But David, you mentioned Laurie Styler, who called you. Well, we have a great thanks to Laurie Styler, the agent, who really worked to put all this together.
Yeah, keep the mic up. Yeah.
Laurie Styler, who really worked to put all this together. But I just wanted to add something. I saw a place on the West Coast, and I felt we should have an actor studio on the West Coast. I called Paul at the time. I said, Paul, I found a place that has the New York atmosphere. It's a perfect place to start an actor studio. Paul said, are you crazy? An actor studio in Hollywood? What's the matter with you, Jack? And I said, well, listen, you know, Harold Clurman, who influenced both of us, once said, listen, to be in this profession, you have to be crazy. So, Paul, let's act on it, okay? And he said, okay, I'll meet you tomorrow morning. I drove up with a sports car. I got into his car, and he said to me, Jack, it's my 50th birthday. I said, well, congratulations, my God, Paul. Look what you've done. Look what you've accomplished. How amazing. Well, I want to tell you, Jack, when I was a young actor, and someone would have told me that I reached the age of 50 and never play Hamlet, I wouldn't have done it. I would not have done it. So it shows you, in a sense, his senses. And also with Mike, of course, I worked with Mike in a number of plays in LA. I directed him and became very close friends with him. And constant interest always in terms of how do you approach Strindberg? How do you approach Ibsen?
What? How do you approach what? I'm sorry.
The what?
How do you approach? I didn't hear.
How do you approach Strindberg?
Oh, excuse me.
How do you approach Ibsen? What's the difference with Chekhov, you know? And constantly, that was the weekends we spent going over that.
I mean, and this is a particularly interesting example of Chekhov because it's something he wrote very early in his career. I mean, this was some years before The Seagull or anything like that, and it really only came out, if I'm correct, it only came out in translation in English in the 50s, right? Of a volume called The Unknown Chekhov. So this was sort of a recent text.
Yeah.
Was that sort of people?
Let me just add
Yeah,
something,
sure.
Nick, because what's interesting about this play, Chekhov wrote it when he was very young. And it's a very funny story because he said, oh, Dostoevsky is the son of aristocrats, Tolstoy is the son of aristocrats. I'm the grandson of a serf, so I'll do it anyway. And so he wrote this play, and this is what's fascinating. 2 years before his death, he went and rewrote this play. And that's the version that you saw here tonight.
And he was actually also a physician by trade. That's another little twist, I guess. He's giving electron tobacco, but.
But the desperation,
Yeah.
that both Chekhov found and that Mike found,
Yeah.
the habit that Mike had of thinking out loud and going from one thought to the next, and they didn't necessarily connect with the next. That was Mike, too, that found this home in Chekhov, which also allowed him to go deep into his own nature and have it fulfilled so beautifully as an actor. in that particular piece that was like made for him?
Yeah. Well, as I said, what makes a work of art is that's what the studio emphasized, is personal. And what the actors had a chance in the studio in those days to get away from the cliches. They were typecast, you know. And when Kazan was asked, why did you found the actor studio? You founded it. What was the purpose? Oh, just to get actors out of the rain. Right? And then when there was an anniversary, and that was the year he was gone, and the actor studio invited me to go and talk about him. I said, you know, I asked him, but why did you call it actor studio? The board is directors. Why it was called actor studio? Because I said, come on, Jack. It's all in them. It's all in them. All we can do is bring it out, as I told David. We're guides. Everything is in them. How can you work as a painter without knowing color? How can you work a musician without knowing rhythm, music, all that? And then how can you work with an actor without knowing what's inside of him that you stimulate and bring out?
I'm just curious what each of you think in terms of Newman directing this, and what do you see as the imprint he kind of leaves on this, like as a style, or what does he put into it as an actor? I mean, he directed it, but I mean, what do you feel in it that says that's Newman there?
I didn't quite hear.
What does Paul Newman bring to his direction here that kind of, you know, telegraphs his presence?
Well, I think that what he recognized here, aside from the kind of acting he never, aside from the fact, the kind of acting he never saw before, that was happening right there in front of him, and particularly in Chekhov, you know. But I think that the main drive there was to come up to something, to a great challenge, which Chekhov presents in terms of, you know, somebody said to Chekhov, "Oh my God, your characters are so depressing." Chekhov said, "My characters are not depressing because they know what life should be like." See? So.
Oh, go ahead, sure.
I think, I don't know, but I think that as a director myself,
Yeah.
when you see something extraordinary happen, particularly at the studio, and you say, that's so extraordinary that I must put it down on screen so we have it for life, that as a director, all you want to do is to keep your actor safe and to provide. Now, Dick Silbert did the
Production
scenery,
design,
the
yeah.
production for it, you know, who is Mike Nichols' scenic director, so that
Yeah.
they just put up the bare minimums to allow Mike to do his work. I don't think you presume to direct
Of course.
an actor, you know, he just wouldn't do it. He wants to
Well,
preserve.
You know, Lee, so an actor came to see Socrates, 500 BC, when the theater first sort of started. And he said, why am I good in some parts and not so good in other parts, right? And Socrates said to him, you know, I envy your profession. Now, when I mentioned this in a class, and a woman said, listen, I have to ask my husband to come here because I want him to hear what you have to say, you know. And it was a professor of political science. So he said, Mr. Garfein, you said that Socrates envied actors? I said, yes. The only ones he envied was actors. He said, excuse me, I don't think Socrates envied anything. That's true, except acting. What he said to this actor is, I envy you, not because you have to dress well, people recognize you in the streets. That's not what I envy. What I envy is that the gods give the words to the authors, which they themselves don't understand or know the meaning of. And it takes the actor who grasps what is behind those words and brings the expression directly to the public. That's what I envy.
add something to that, if anyone here, if you're not a composer, if you have a relative who's a composer, or if you like listening to Beethoven, Bach, Mozart, Bartok, Schoenberg, Duke Ellington, Thelonious Monk, regardless of the genre, if it's something that's written down, all you can do as a composer is try to get the very best notes that you have. But essentially, in the larger sense, they're really just kind of fly specks on the paper. And when the musicians take those fly specks and can put their personality and what they feel from what the fly specks stimulate them to do, then you have that magical thing, which is music. And it's always a miracle and a mystery when you write something and you get really fine musicians to play it. Wow, that's indescribable. And I mentioned that because the same thing in society. When I was a kid, I was told, well, composing is a creative art, and playing music is a more or less a performing art or an interpretive art. And actually, it's all creative, including listening and seeing. And being here tonight with all of you and seeing that fantastic movie, part of it was not have the empty theater like the gentleman did in the play, but the relationship of what the idea of catharsis came from. I studied all that stuff in school, but I never knew what that meant till I was on the Mike Douglas show with Tony Bennett. And there was a whole bunch of people, all looked like a wax museum, sitting there at the dress rehearsal, like zombies, including myself. And then he started singing. Suddenly, everything came alive. I said, Tony, that was fantastic, man. You turned that studio from a morgue into a celebratory New Orleans, happy, heavenly, artistic experience. He said, that's what Louis Armstrong told me. He said, you get it, you send it out, it comes back, then you send it out the second time, and then it comes back. Wow. And he said, that's what they call catharsis. And when I was working in the actor studio, Estelle invited me to a production of the Medea, where they were having Al Pacino play that. Suddenly, about the third or fourth day, all those young actors, suddenly, they were part of it. And I could see people in their 20s, and I realized they were as lucky as I was to be around some excellence as a young person, and that they would carry that with them all their lives. And 50 years later, at the actor studio right in New York City, that same beautiful, collaborative, interdisciplinary, whatever you want to call it, the human feeling, that catharsis was still there. It always will be there. We can be happy that that does exist. So no matter how depressing the times may be at the moment, that, as they say in the Bible, that too shall pass. But something like we see that's so beautiful here, and the theater, as it was several thousand years ago, always will be the center of expression and beauty and better social life, better social progress.
Just to add one thing, apropos what you said. One of the last things I heard, Harold Clurman is a great director and teacher. One of the last things I heard him say was, listen, theater is so important now that even bad theater is important. Don't miss bad theater, because you see human beings instead of images that are sent to you by other people. Fine, that has its place, images, cell phones, all this stuff. But the theater, there's one thing, is that you confront human beings in action. And that's why he said even bad theater is important to see.
I want to make sure we
Also,
get...
excuse me, I just want to add one thing. I was teaching a directing class.
Hold on, Mike.
I was teaching a directing class. I was teaching a directing class in London, and I asked them always to read the classics, you know. And they said to me, I don't understand. Why do I have to read Tolstoy, Turgenev? What's the point, Mr. Garfein? I said, more important today, because when you read, you create your own images instead of getting somebody else's images. Fine, you can enjoy that. But in reading, you create your own images. And that's why I had them constantly tell them, keep reading the classics.
Don't you think that Jack could play that part? Huh? Wouldn't I cast him right now?
We can do a workshop afterwards.
Well, Estelle, is that okay to cast Jack in that? Estelle is the force in the studio, the artistic force. And, whoa,
There we go. It started here. I want to make sure we get questions from the audience. So does anyone have any questions? Yes. I'm just going to repeat the question to make sure everyone heard it. The question is how directing differs when it's coming from a person who's an actor as well. How directing is different if it comes from a person who's also established as an actor already.
well, the only example I could give as a former actor who became a director is that there's so much confidence in the actor once the actor has been cast in it, that I would not dream of giving a character direction. I mean, it was like Hal Ashby always used to say to me, "Surprise me." And I think that's what acting is all about. Once you've cast it and they're, surprise me. And then that frees the actor to just bring to the character whatever they can dream of and dig into. And I think that's what the thrilling thing about directing an actor is.
Lee, that's so true. Well, I had a direct experience with Mike Strong, because I directed my first Broadway play. It started off Broadway when I was 23. And so then I directed Mike in a play, and the first day of rehearsal, I showed up with a big directing book. And Mike said, "Jesus, Jack, what do you got there?" I said, "It's my directing book." "You scare me, Jack. You frighten me. I got to think about what has he got. Please, Jack, can you put the directing book away? Just watch me work, see what I do, and then you can make suggestions. We'll work together. Please put it away."
Another question. Yeah. The question is that you mentioned one of the reasons that Paul Newman took his name off the film was because his wife had some sort of opposition to it. Why would that be?
But you're talking.
Hold on the mic. Oh, don't forget the mic.
No, I think that she just she didn't care for the film, and that he was devote all that time to it and so on, I think. And then he said she didn't like it, okay? But the main thing was that, of course, in those days, you have a 25-minute film, you know, what distributor is going to take an unknown actor? I mean, if you had, you know, some big Hollywood star, they'd go for it, you know. So I think that was the problem.
But for him, was this short, it seems this short was maybe more just a way for him to kind of dip a toe into film directing, you know?
Well, I think that the film directing was, he wanted to do something, he felt if he was going to direct, and he always wanted to direct, and I think from what I sensed from him, is that he was so excited by being in the actor studio in those days and what was happening, that it was something new that was happening. And when he saw an actor like this do that kind of work, he felt that's why he was there, and he wanted the world to see that, what was happening there.
So to kind of give it an even bigger audience in
Yeah.
a way, yeah. Oh, let's go way in the back there, waving. So it's just, in case you didn't hear, it's just about Michael Strong's work in television as well. And this is just such an interesting period in a way, because you have people moving between film and theater, and then later doing TV as well. And Jack, of course, you directed a film, Something Wild. That was just before this or just after this? When did you direct Something Wild? Was that before the production of this short, or?
Oh no, I directed this film after.
Right. Okay. After
Mike
that.
did this early.
Yeah. So.
Early on, I think I directed my first film, The Strange One, which was developed in the actor studio and
Right,
introduced all the actors from the studio. And interesting, when I started that work, I was 20, 21, and I said to the actors, "Now look, the reason I had to go to them, none of the actors with names would have anything to do with me, you know. I was the kid, so anyway. So I went all to the new actors. Ben Gazzara, George Peppard, what's his name? Paul Richards, you know, Pat Hengel, right? Because they were newcomers in the studio, and Steve McQueen. And I said to them, now look, we're not going to say an equity rule. We're going to rehearse for 3 weeks, and then we're going to show it to the studio. I said, we're going to only show it when I feel that the characters have arrived. I wouldn't tell them just what Lee said. Not the characters have to emerge. You don't tell an actor, this is your character. You set the conditions so that you see the emerging. I said, well, when that happens, I'll put it on in the studio. They had never put on a full show in the actor's studio, right? The actors were shaking. And they said, are you crazy? You're going to do it? Yeah, we're going to do it. And so we did. We put it on, but I know one night it was amazing. We were rehearsing late at night because we all had jobs. I was a package boy in the Hotel Beacon. Ben Gazzara was answering the phone for the New York Times. So we had to meet after work. So we met, and at that time the actor's studio was on the 7th floor of the Anta building. And so one night we hear footsteps coming up the stairs late, about 11 o'clock. And we turned to Pat Hengel and said, Pat, you were the last guy who left the door open. He said, no, I didn't. I locked the door. And now the steps come closer, right? And Jimmy grabs a chair, and Ben Gazzara grabs a chair on the other side, and the door opens, and it's Kazan walks in. And he said, I was walking down Broadway. I saw the lights on, and I wondered what was going on here. So I introduced myself. I said, I'm Jack Garfein, the director. This is Steve McQueen. This is Pat Hengel, Ben Gazzara. Introduced everybody. He said, well, if you guys come up and walk 7 flights of stairs after your jobs, and you come up and you rehearse a play, I will predict right now, each of you will make an important contribution in theater and in film.
I just want to make sure people have a chance to ask questions. If we just have a couple more, maybe here on the end. Lee, it was about working in television and shows like Playhouse 90.
Yeah,
Lee, you mentioned.
that was a period that I worked in television. I couldn't tell you, but you have, you know, the greatest names, Patty Chayefsky and Horton Foote and all of those incredible writers were working in television then, and we took it for granted. We had the studio, we had these great writers, and you just, did your job, and it was all in one day. It was all shot in one day with the cameras going from one camera to the next. It was very primitive.
I had a different experience because I got my first television show was The Marriage with Hume Cronin and Jessica Tandy. And when they talked to me, I said, now look, I'm not going to rehearse the show the way television does. Oh, the actors rehearse, then the camera comes in over the shoulder, this and that. I said, no. I want the camera people to come in while I'm rehearsing the play, and I want them to watch what they're doing. They never heard of that, but Hume went along, and so and at that time, television was live, they had an audience, and this was a comedy. And so they got very nervous because I did that kind of a thing, saying, well, the audience came in and they howled with laughter, and then got great reviews, and AT&T was interested in backing it, but the producers got nervous. So when I came to do the next show, they said, okay, now Jack, please, let's do it now this way. The camera people will come in for a technical. I said, no, we're not doing it that way. We're doing it my way, or else forget it. I was all of 24, when I showed up at NBC. I said, Jack Garfein. The guard said, your father isn't here yet. So anyway, I did the second show, and they let me do the second show. But then I realized it's getting impossible because they said, the third show, you cannot do that anymore. They thought they would get bad reviews. Instead, they got even better reviews and more sponsors, but I was let go. And of course, they hired a standard television director who had a name, but it was television work. And then he left after 2 weeks, they hired another big name television director. And that was it. And then I got a letter from Newman, Jessica. Dear Jack, yours were the best 2 shows we've ever done on television. Which just shows you that you don't go with the rules and regulations, that you go with life, what the essence is of the story, and that has to be captured and that has to be seen, and not, this angle, this go over the shoulder, not over here at this point, without knowing the story, without having seen anything with the actors. And I also insisted on long rehearsals. So it's just a matter of, again, those are media. Okay, I'll give you a perfect example. I got my first film, The Strange One. How did I get it? Kazan had just done On the Waterfront, won the Academy Award. So did Sam Spiegel. Sam Spiegel saw Ender's a Man. He said to Kazan, I want to do this movie. I want you to direct it. Kazan said, Garfein is the best man for it. Spiegel said, the kid? He said, yeah, the kid. He's the best man for it, right? Well, then Kazan talked to me, get a great cameraman, Jack, make sure of that, which I did. But you can imagine, Bernard Guffey was my cameraman, who did, forgot the last movie, but anyway, the first day of shooting, my shirt was wet, right? I came in, I was almost shaking, and I turned to Bernie, and I said, now Bernie, in this scene, where do you want me to set this scene of the actors, so the angle of the camera?
Talk.
He said, Jack, this is a machine, you understand? It's only a machine. It's there to capture what you and the actors create. You please give me sleepless nights, Jack. So I say, how am I gonna shoot the scene? How am I gonna capture what those actors are doing? Now please, Jack, just remember that. And it was a great lesson in terms of that.
Could I add one tiny thing to your statement? 1960, the first film score I ever did was the first, not counting Pull My Daisy, which was a home movie that became a film 45 years later because of Jack Kerouac's genius narration. But the first real one I did was Splendor of the Grass right here in New York. That was just like working, thank you. That was just like working in the New York theater. All the actors, Kazan directing it, everybody there, the cameraman, the people who went out and got us lunch, whoever was there, we were like one gigantic involved family of people all trying to do something good. And Kazan just inspired us all to pay attention, love what we were doing, and see if we could do better than we thought we could. Then I got my first chance to go out to Hollywood for one called the Young Savages, and I stayed at a place called the Montecito Hotel, which is where all the New York actors stayed, and they always had a little blackboard with everybody's name on it, and almost everybody was from the New York theater coming out to make enough in a week so they could go back to the theater and somehow pay the rent. And I remember going to the swimming pool. I saw Estelle Parsons again for the first time, not at the Theater de Lys, but she and Lottie Lehman and some of these great actors were out there giving a fantastic performance of Three Penny Opera, and a whole bunch of other people, Pat Hingle, whom you mentioned, and so many other great actors, but most of them only had copies of the New York Times, and everybody would sit around the swimming pool reading the New York Times and talking about their off-Broadway play that they were doing, or how they did Ibsen, Chekhov, or Shakespeare in the park. And nobody mentioned if they were doing Wagon Train or anything else. But the great thing was that when they came into that television world, they brought all that excellence and devotion and beauty with them. And years after this film was made, when I was working at the Lincoln Center Theater, Michael Strong was in the production After the Fall and Incident of Vichy that I was blessed to be able to work on. And I said to him, man, that film was so beautiful. I sure hope that gets seen. And he said, David, all good things come to those who wait. And he had to wait a long time, but tonight, the wait is over.
All right, I think we're just about the end of our time. Maybe we have time for one more question, then we'll wrap up. But the conversation then can continue in the Furman Gallery next door. One more question. Let's see. Okay, right up here. So the question is, where would a short film like this be shown at the time? At the Thalia, for one.
Well, I also sort of have planned to do a documentary with it about Chekhov, to show, for example, there's a performance by a Russian actor in Russia. There are other performances of Chekhov on the same piece, and I thought that end up with Mike, so you can see the difference in terms of the approach and the work, and also a lot about Chekhov, the fact of what he thought, what his feelings were about it, and to me it's fascinating that 2 years before his death, this is what he spent time rewriting. Imagine what part of his life that came out of. That was one idea. The other is just to see. Excuse me. Is just to see if for example, to find the right short or the right thing to go with it. But it's almost impossible to come up to this level of work that I have seen yet. I mean, so I don't know. This is the first time it's being screened, and I've been thinking many ways of how to go with it.
All right, well, that brings us to the end here. Thank all of you so much.